Most people think avoidant attachment begins in adulthood. They see someone pull away from love, struggle with intimacy, or become distant in relationships, and they assume that person simply fears commitment or doesn't want closeness. But the truth is far deeper and far more human. Avoidant attachment does not suddenly appear in adulthood. It begins quietly, long before romantic relationships ever exist. It begins in childhood, in small everyday moments that most people would never notice. Moments that slowly teach a child one heartbreaking lesson: that needing someone emotionally might not be safe. Imagine a young child in a room. They fall, scrape their knee, and instinctively look toward the person they trust the most. This moment seems simple, almost ordinary, but psychologically it is incredibly important. Children are wired to reach for comfort. They are not taught to do it. It is built into them. When they are scared, hurt, confused, or overwhelmed, their first instinct is to move toward connection. They look for a face that feels safe, a voice that soothes them, arms that hold them. This is how the human nervous system learns what safety feels like. But now imagine something slightly different. The child looks up for comfort, and nothing really comes back. Maybe the caregiver is physically present, but emotionally distracted. Maybe they respond with irritation instead of warmth. Maybe they say something like, "You're fine, stop crying." Maybe they are overwhelmed themselves and don't have the emotional capacity to respond. Whatever the reason, the moment passes without the comfort the child expected. At first, the child doesn't understand what happened. They still believe comfort will come next time. So the next time they feel scared or sad, they reach out again. And again, the response is cold, dismissive, impatient, or emotionally distant. Slowly, something begins to change inside the child's mind. Not consciously, not in words, but in feeling. The child begins to sense that expressing emotion might not lead to comfort. It might lead to rejection, annoyance, or emotional emptiness. This is where avoidant attachment begins to take its first tiny roots. Not through cruelty, not through dramatic trauma in many cases, but through repeated experiences where emotional needs quietly go unmet. The child's nervous system starts learning a new rule about the world. A rule that sounds something like this: when I feel something deeply, it's better not to show it. And the heartbreaking part is that the child does not make this decision because they are strong or independent. They make it because they are trying to survive emotionally. Children depend on caregivers completely. They cannot leave. They cannot change their environment. The only thing they can adapt is themselves. So they begin adapting their emotional behavior. And over time, something subtle but powerful happens. The child begins to turn inward. Every child enters the world with the same emotional blueprint. They are born expecting connection, expecting comfort, expecting that when they feel something overwhelming, someone will help them regulate it. This expectation is not weakness, it is the foundation of emotional development. When a child cries, they are not being dramatic. They are signaling distress. When they run toward a caregiver after being scared, they are seeking safety. These moments are the building blocks of emotional security. Each time a caregiver responds with warmth, the child's brain quietly records something important. When I feel something difficult, I am not alone. But when those moments repeatedly lead to emotional distance instead, the child begins learning a different lesson. At first, it is confusing. The child still tries to seek closeness, but if comfort repeatedly fails to appear, the brain slowly begins adjusting expectations. Think of it like touching a door that looks warm and welcoming, only to discover it is cold every time. Eventually, you stop reaching for that door. For a child, this process is even more powerful because their brain is still developing. Each experience shapes how they understand relationships. When comfort feels inconsistent or unavailable, the child begins unconsciously protecting themselves from disappointment. One of the ways the mind protects itself is by reducing emotional expression. The child learns something subtle. Expressing vulnerability does not help. So the brain slowly turns down the volume on emotional signals. The child cries less. They ask for help less. They begin handling things internally instead of reaching outward. To adults watching from the outside, this might even look impressive. The child might seem calm, mature, and independent compared to other children who cry or seek attention. People may say things like, "What a strong kid," or "They're so easy to take care of." But what is really happening is much more complex. The child is not becoming emotionally secure. They are becoming emotionally cautious. Inside, the need for comfort still exists. The longing for connection is still there, but the child has begun learning that showing those needs may not lead anywhere good. So instead of reaching outward, they begin managing everything inside their own mind. This is one of the earliest foundations of avoidant attachment: emotional self containment. The child is not choosing independence because it feels good. They are choosing it because it feels safer than rejection. One of the most misunderstood parts of avoidant attachment is how ordinary the childhood environment can sometimes look from the outside. People often assume avoidant patterns only come from severe neglect or obvious abuse, but in many cases, the environment appears stable. The child has food, clothing, education, and structure. The missing piece is emotional responsiveness. A caregiver might provide everything a child physically needs while still struggling with emotional connection. They may not know how to respond to vulnerability. Maybe they grew up in an environment where emotions were dismissed. Maybe they believe toughness is the best way to raise children. Maybe they feel uncomfortable with emotional expression and unintentionally shut it down. When a child expresses sadness and hears "stop being dramatic," something small but significant happens inside their mind. When they feel scared and someone says "you're overreacting," another emotional signal gets dismissed. Over time, these messages begin shaping the child's internal world. The child starts noticing that certain emotions receive negative reactions. Crying might bring irritation. Fear might bring criticism. Vulnerability might bring silence. The brain begins recognizing patterns very quickly. So the child adjusts their behavior. They begin hiding emotions that create uncomfortable reactions from caregivers. They keep sadness quieter. They push down fear. They stop sharing certain feelings altogether. This adaptation can happen slowly and quietly. There is rarely a dramatic moment where the child decides, "I will stop needing people." Instead, the decision unfolds through hundreds of small interactions. Each time an emotional need is dismissed, the child's nervous system becomes slightly more guarded. Eventually, the child stops expecting emotional understanding, not because they want to disconnect, but because expecting connection has become too disappointing. This is when independence begins taking on a different meaning. It is no longer just a personality trait. It becomes a defense. At a certain point, something deeply tragic begins to happen inside the avoidant child's emotional world. They begin to realize that being easy makes life smoother. When they don't cry, caregivers seem calmer. When they solve problems alone, adults seem proud. When they suppress emotional reactions, the household feels more stable. So the child begins becoming what many adults unknowingly reward: the low maintenance child. This child rarely complains. They handle disappointment quietly. They don't ask for much help. They seem mature for their age. Teachers may describe them as independent. Family members may praise them for being strong. But beneath that calm surface is often a silent, emotional withdrawal. The child is not learning how to process feelings. They are learning how to contain them. Instead of experiencing emotions openly and receiving support, they begin processing everything alone. Sadness becomes something to hide. Fear becomes something to push away. Vulnerability becomes something dangerous to reveal. Over time, this emotional containment begins shaping the child's identity. They start seeing themselves as someone who shouldn't need others. They may feel uncomfortable when people try to get emotionally close. They may even feel confused when others express strong feelings, because emotional intensity was never something their environment handled well. But the deepest part of the avoidant child's experience is rarely visible. Even though they appear independent, the need for connection never disappears. Humans are wired for attachment. The desire for closeness remains somewhere beneath the surface. The problem is that the child has learned closeness might not feel safe, so they begin building invisible emotional walls. These walls do not appear overnight. They form slowly, layer by layer, each time vulnerability leads to discomfort or rejection. And eventually, those walls become part of how the child protects themselves from emotional pain. Perhaps the most heartbreaking moment in the development of avoidant attachment is not when the child first experiences emotional dismissal. It is the moment they quietly stop trying to seek comfort. This moment rarely has witnesses. It might happen after a long series of small disappointments. A child who once ran toward their caregiver when upset might begin sitting alone instead. A child who once cried openly might start holding tears back. A child who once asked for reassurance might start telling themselves everything is fine. To an adult observer, the child might look calmer than before. But internally, something important has shifted. The child has stopped expecting emotional safety from others. This change does not happen because the child stops needing love. In fact, the need for love remains just as strong. What changes is their expectation that love will meet them in moments of vulnerability, so the brain adapts. Instead of seeking comfort externally, the child begins creating emotional distance internally. They distract themselves from difficult feelings, they minimize emotional experiences, they convince themselves that needing others is unnecessary. These strategies work surprisingly well in the short term. The child becomes resilient in certain ways. They learn to solve problems independently. They manage emotions quietly. They rarely burden others with their struggles, but there is a long-term cost to this emotional survival strategy. Because when emotional needs are repeatedly suppressed instead of supported, the nervous system begins associating vulnerability with danger. Expressing feelings starts to feel uncomfortable. Depending on others begins to feel risky. And this pattern does not disappear when childhood ends. Years later, the same child may grow into an adult who struggles to understand their own reactions in relationships. They may care deeply about someone, but suddenly feel the urge to pull away when things become emotionally intense. They may value independence so strongly that closeness begins to feel overwhelming. From the outside, people might see someone who seems distant or detached, but the deeper truth is much more human. That adult was once a child who needed comfort and slowly learned how to live without expecting it. And that lesson, learned quietly in childhood, can shape the way the heart protects itself for years to come. And once a child begins living this way, something very subtle starts happening inside their emotional world. They begin organizing their entire personality around one quiet belief that the safest way to exist is to rely only on themselves. At first, this belief is not something they can explain with words. It is simply a feeling that develops in the background of their mind. When they feel sad, they handle it alone. When they feel afraid, they distract themselves. When something hurts emotionally, they bury it instead of sharing it. Over time, this pattern becomes so normal that the child stops even considering the possibility of emotional support. It is not that they think support is bad, it simply feels unfamiliar, almost unnatural. Imagine being a child who learns very early that your emotional world belongs only to you. Other children might run to their parents when something goes wrong. They might seek reassurance after a frightening experience. But the avoidant child begins learning to sit with their feelings quietly. They develop an internal voice that says, "You'll be fine, just deal with it." That voice might sound strong on the surface, but underneath it is a coping strategy built from repeated emotional disappointment. Each time they handle pain alone, the brain reinforces the idea that independence is the safest path. This doesn't mean the child stops caring about others. It simply means they begin protecting themselves from the possibility of emotional rejection. The strange part is that adults often admire this behavior. When a child handles everything quietly, people tend to see it as maturity. Teachers might say the child is responsible. Family members might describe them as tough or resilient. But what many people fail to notice is the absence of emotional openness. The child rarely shares what they feel inside. They keep their struggles hidden behind a calm exterior. And slowly, this emotional silence becomes their identity. They are no longer just a child who learned to cope alone. They begin believing they are the type of person who should cope alone. This is where the foundation of avoidant attachment becomes deeply rooted, because once a child internalizes the belief that their feelings are something they must manage privately, it changes how they view relationships entirely. Connection becomes something that exists at a distance. They can care about people, laugh with them, and spend time together, but the deepest parts of their emotional experience remain guarded. Even if they don't consciously realize it, they are constantly maintaining a protective boundary around their vulnerability. And the most important thing to understand is that none of this happens because the child wanted to disconnect. It happens because their mind was trying to protect them from the pain of unmet emotional needs. As this pattern continues, the child begins developing a remarkable ability to suppress emotions that feel overwhelming. Human beings naturally experience waves of emotion throughout the day: sadness, excitement, fear, disappointment, joy. For most children, these feelings move through them freely. They cry when they are hurt, laugh when they feel happy, and express fear when something scares them. But for the avoidant child, emotional expression slowly becomes filtered. Certain feelings begin to feel unacceptable. If sadness once led to dismissal, the child starts pushing sadness down. If fear once led to criticism, they begin hiding fear as well. Even longing for affection can feel risky if it has repeatedly gone unanswered. The child's brain begins managing these emotions by minimizing them. Instead of feeling something deeply, they quickly convince themselves it doesn't matter. This process is incredibly powerful because it teaches the child how to detach from emotional intensity. Detachment becomes a skill they practice again and again. When something painful happens, they shift their attention away from it. When someone asks how they feel, they might say, "I'm fine," even when something inside them is hurting. Over time, they become so skilled at emotional suppression that even they struggle to recognize what they are feeling. From the outside, this emotional control can look impressive. The child may appear calm in situations where other children panic. They might stay composed when others cry. Adults may praise them for being level-headed, but the truth is more complicated. Emotional control is not the same as emotional security. The avoidant child is not necessarily processing their feelings in a healthy way. They are simply becoming very good at hiding them, even from themselves. Inside, the emotional needs still exist. The desire to feel understood and supported is still present, but expressing those needs feels dangerous. So the mind begins doing something extraordinary. It creates distance between the child and their own vulnerability. This distance becomes the beginning of the emotional wall that will later define avoidant attachment in adulthood. Another important shift begins happening during this stage of childhood. The avoidant child starts associating closeness with discomfort. When someone tries to get emotionally close, it triggers something unfamiliar in their nervous system. Instead of feeling safe, the child might feel uneasy or tense. Not because the person is harmful, but because closeness itself feels unpredictable. Remember, this child learned early on that vulnerability could lead to emotional rejection. So when closeness appears, their brain quietly prepares for disappointment. Even if nothing bad is happening in the present moment, their past experiences shape how they interpret intimacy. You might see this when someone tries to comfort the child. Instead of leaning into the hug, they might stiffen or pull away slightly. When someone asks them about their feelings, they might shrug and change the subject. When emotional conversations begin, they may become quiet or distracted. These reactions are not signs that the child doesn't care. They are signs that the child never learned how safe emotional closeness can feel. Over time, this discomfort with intimacy begins shaping the child's relationships with friends as well. They may enjoy spending time with others, but they keep conversations light and surface level. They joke, play, and socialize like any other child, but they rarely reveal their deeper emotional experiences. Their friendships often revolve around activities rather than emotional sharing. Again, adults may not notice anything unusual. The child still has friends. They still participate in life. But beneath that normal appearance lies an invisible boundary. The child instinctively avoids situations that require deep emotional exposure. And because they have practiced emotional independence for so long, they often feel more comfortable handling problems alone than asking anyone for help. By the time the avoidant child reaches later stages of development, their emotional coping strategy has become deeply ingrained. The pattern of self-reliance feels natural. Asking for help feels awkward. Expressing vulnerability feels unnecessary or even embarrassing. If someone tries to offer emotional support, the child may respond politely but keep their internal world closed. One of the most complex aspects of this stage is the quiet belief system forming inside the child's mind. They may begin thinking things like, "I don't really need anyone," or "people should handle their own problems." These beliefs are not born from arrogance or coldness. They are protective conclusions drawn from years of experience. If emotional needs rarely received the response they hoped for, the brain decides it is safer not to depend on others at all. This belief system helps the child maintain stability. It allows them to move through life without constantly feeling disappointed. But it also creates distance between them and the emotional connections that humans naturally crave. Deep inside, there may still be moments when the child feels a quiet longing for closeness. Maybe they watch another child receive comfort from a parent. Maybe they notice friends sharing personal feelings with each other. In those moments, something inside them might stir a sense of curiosity or even envy. But that feeling often disappears quickly, replaced by the familiar voice that says independence is better. And so the emotional wall grows stronger. The child becomes increasingly skilled at functioning without emotional support. They focus on achievements, responsibilities, or distractions that keep them moving forward. Their life continues normally on the surface, but the deeper layers of connection remain unexplored. What they don't realize yet is that this same pattern will follow them into adulthood, shaping the way they experience love and intimacy in ways that can feel confusing later on. Eventually, the child who once needed comfort so deeply grows into someone who seems remarkably self-sufficient. They appear strong, calm, and independent. People around them might admire their ability to stay composed under pressure. They rarely rely on others emotionally, and they often prefer solving problems alone. On the surface, it looks like they have mastered life, but inside, the emotional story is far more complicated. Because the truth is that the need for connection never disappears. Humans are wired for attachment from the moment they are born. Even the most independent person still carries a deep biological longing to feel seen, understood, and emotionally safe with another person. For someone shaped by avoidant attachment, this longing exists alongside a powerful instinct to protect themselves from vulnerability. These two forces live side by side inside them. One part quietly hopes for closeness, while another part becomes anxious the moment intimacy begins to deepen. This inner conflict can be incredibly confusing later in life. When relationships start forming, the avoidant individual may genuinely enjoy the connection at first. Spending time together feels comfortable, light, and enjoyable. But as emotional intimacy grows, something unfamiliar begins to happen. The deeper the connection becomes, the more their old protective system activates. Suddenly, they might feel overwhelmed by closeness. They may begin craving space without fully understanding why. Conversations about feelings might make them uncomfortable. Even small expectations of emotional availability can start to feel heavy. From the outside, people may interpret this behavior as disinterest or coldness. But in reality, what they are witnessing is a childhood survival strategy resurfacing. The same emotional walls built long ago are now trying to protect the adult from vulnerability. And this is the heartbreaking irony of avoidant attachment. The child who once needed comfort so desperately became an adult who struggles to accept it when it finally appears. They are not distant because they lack feelings. They are distant because their mind learned very early that emotional closeness might lead to pain. So even when love enters their life, a part of them still remembers those early lessons. The child who once sat quietly with their feelings, who stopped crying because no one responded, who learned to solve problems alone, still lives somewhere inside that adult. And understanding that truth changes how we see avoidant attachment entirely. Because behind the distance, behind the independence, behind the quiet emotional walls, there was once a child simply trying to protect their heart, the only way they knew how. And this is the part of the story that most people never see. When someone develops avoidant attachment, the outside world often misreads them completely. Friends, partners, and even family members may assume that this person simply doesn't care very deeply about relationships. They may think the avoidant person prefers distance, enjoys independence more than connection, or simply lacks emotional depth. But the truth is often the exact opposite. Inside the avoidant person lives the same human need for closeness that exists in everyone else. They still want to feel understood. They still want someone who sees them completely. They still want the quiet comfort of knowing someone is there when life becomes overwhelming. The difference is that their nervous system learned a different lesson very early in life. Instead of learning that closeness brings comfort, they learned that closeness can bring emotional risk. So their mind created a protective system that activates whenever intimacy begins to deepen. This system works quietly and automatically. At first, when they meet someone new, everything can feel easy and natural. Early relationships often feel safe because they are still light. Conversations are fun, laughter comes easily, and emotional expectations remain low. The avoidant person may feel relaxed because nothing is demanding deep vulnerability yet, but slowly something begins to change. As emotional closeness starts growing, subtle pressure begins building inside their mind. The more someone tries to understand them deeply, the more their old emotional defenses start waking up. Questions about feelings may suddenly feel uncomfortable. Moments that require emotional openness might feel overwhelming. And without fully understanding why, the avoidant person may begin creating distance. Sometimes this distance shows up as needing space. Sometimes it appears as becoming quieter during emotional conversations. Sometimes it becomes a sudden feeling that the relationship is moving too fast or becoming too intense. From the outside, this behavior can feel confusing or even hurtful. But inside the avoidant person, something much more complicated is happening. Their childhood survival system is activating. And that system was built long before they understood what love truly meant. One of the most painful aspects of avoidant attachment is the internal conflict it creates. The avoidant person does not simply reject connection. Instead, they often experience two powerful emotional forces pulling them in opposite directions. One part of them longs for closeness. This part of them enjoys companionship, meaningful conversations, shared experiences, and emotional warmth. It feels good to laugh with someone, to spend time together, and to feel understood. These moments awaken something deep and human inside them. But another part of them feels alarmed by the very same closeness. This part remembers the emotional lessons learned in childhood. It remembers the disappointment of vulnerability not being met with comfort. It remembers the quiet decision to stop depending on others. So when emotional intimacy begins growing, this protective part of the mind begins whispering warnings. It may say things like, "You're getting too close," or "You should slow down," or even "You might get hurt." These thoughts don't always appear as clear sentences. Sometimes they appear as feelings. A sudden sense of restlessness, a desire for space, a strange emotional numbness that appears during moments of closeness. The avoidant person might not even realize why they feel this way. All they know is that something inside them becomes uneasy when relationships start becoming deeply emotional, so they instinctively create distance to calm that feeling. But the distance rarely feels completely right either, because the other part of them, the part that still longs for connection, feels the loss of closeness once the space appears. And so the avoidant person begins living inside a quiet, emotional tug of war. One part moves toward connection, another part pulls away to stay safe. To truly understand avoidant attachment, we have to look deeper at the emotional walls built during childhood. These walls were never meant to block love forever. They were meant to block pain. When a child repeatedly experiences emotional dismissal, their mind does something incredibly intelligent. It begins protecting them from the emotional wounds of rejection by reducing their dependence on emotional closeness. At the time, the strategy works. The child stops feeling the sharp disappointment of unmet emotional needs. They stop expecting comfort, which means they stop feeling hurt when it doesn't arrive. But emotional defenses rarely disappear as life changes. The walls built to survive childhood often remain standing long after the environment has changed. When the avoidant child becomes an adult, those same walls may still rise automatically whenever vulnerability appears. The difference now is that these walls can interfere with relationships that might actually be safe and supportive. Imagine someone who spent years learning not to open their emotional door. Even when someone kind and patient knocks, the instinct is still to keep the door closed. Not because the visitor is dangerous, but because opening the door feels unfamiliar. This is why avoidant individuals often struggle with emotional closeness even when they genuinely care about someone. The discomfort does not come from the other person. It comes from the protective system built long ago. And perhaps the most tragic part is that many avoidant individuals judge themselves for this reaction. They may feel guilty for pulling away. They may wonder why intimacy feels harder for them than it seems to be for others. But what they are experiencing is not a personal flaw. It is the echo of a childhood adaptation that once helped them survive emotionally. As avoidant individuals move through life, they often become experts at maintaining a certain type of emotional balance. They learn how to keep relationships at a comfortable distance where closeness exists, but vulnerability remains limited. This balance allows them to experience connection without triggering their deepest fears. They may enjoy companionship, share activities, and build meaningful bonds with people. But the deeper emotional layers of their inner world often remain hidden. Sometimes this happens without conscious awareness. When conversations begin approaching sensitive topics, they might change the subject. When someone asks how they truly feel, they might give a short answer or laugh it off. When emotional tension appears, they might retreat into silence or distraction. These behaviors are not intentional acts of rejection. They are habits shaped by years of emotional self-protection. But over time, maintaining these emotional boundaries can create a sense of isolation. Even when surrounded by people, avoidant individuals may sometimes feel as if no one truly understands them. Their relationships may feel close in certain ways, but distant in others. This can create a quiet loneliness that is difficult to explain, because on the surface, everything looks fine. They have friendships. They may have romantic relationships. They participate in life like everyone else. Yet somewhere inside them, a deeper emotional connection still feels just out of reach. And the reason traces all the way back to those early childhood moments when emotional needs quietly went unmet. Understanding how avoidant attachment begins in childhood changes the way we see people who struggle with emotional closeness. It reminds us that behind every avoidant pattern lies a human story. A story of a child who once reached outward for comfort and slowly learned to turn inward instead. A story of emotional survival. When we look at avoidant behavior without understanding its origins, it can appear confusing or even hurtful. Someone might pull away when things feel good. They might struggle to express feelings or seem uncomfortable with vulnerability. But when we understand where these patterns begin, the picture becomes clearer. Avoidant attachment is not about lacking love. It is about learning, very early in life, that expressing emotional needs might not lead to safety. So the child adapts. They become strong, independent, quietly resilient. They learn how to survive emotionally without relying on others. And that strength can carry them through many challenges in life. But the heart still remembers what it always needed. Somewhere beneath the independence and emotional control lives the same human desire that exists in everyone else, the desire to feel seen, accepted, and safe with another person. The journey of understanding avoidant attachment is not about blaming childhood or pointing fingers at caregivers. Most parents and guardians do the best they can with the emotional tools they were given. Instead, this understanding invites compassion. Compassion for the child who learned to hide their feelings. Compassion for the adult who still carries those protective patterns, and compassion for the deeply human truth that every person, no matter how independent they appear, once began life simply hoping someone would be there when they needed comfort. Because behind every avoidant heart is not a lack of love. There is simply a story of a child who learned how to survive without it. Avoidant attachment doesn't just affect relationships later in life, it also shapes how someone experiences their own emotions. A child who learns to suppress feelings doesn't suddenly become emotionally open as an adult. Instead, they often carry that habit quietly for years. When emotions were something they had to control rather than share, their mind becomes skilled at pushing feelings aside. At first, this protects them from disappointment, but later it can make it difficult to even recognize what they feel. Many avoidant individuals actually feel emotions very deeply. The difference is that their mind quickly shuts those emotions down when they become overwhelming. When sadness appears, they distract themselves. When anger rises, they rationalize it away. When vulnerability shows up in a relationship, they suddenly feel the urge to create space without fully understanding why. This emotional distancing happens so automatically that they may not even notice it. Over time, it creates a quiet barrier between them and their own feelings. Because of this, simple questions like, "How are you really feeling?" can be surprisingly difficult to answer. It's not that they are trying to hide the truth, they often genuinely don't know. Their mind learned long ago that emotions were something to move past quickly, rather than something to explore, so they may sense that something feels unsettled inside them, yet struggle to explain it. And all of this traces back to that early childhood lesson. Feelings were safer when kept inside. Avoidant attachment also changes how someone experiences dependence. For most people, leaning on others during difficult moments feels natural, but for someone shaped by avoidant attachment, depending on someone else can feel uncomfortable or even unsafe. As a child, reaching for comfort may have been met with distance or dismissal. Over time, the mind forms a protective rule. It's better not to depend too much on anyone. This belief becomes part of their identity. They see themselves as independent, capable, and self-reliant. They handle problems alone and take pride in managing life without needing too much support. In many ways, this independence becomes one of their strengths, but it also carries a hidden cost. When life becomes overwhelming, as it inevitably does for everyone, they may isolate themselves instead of reaching out. Even when help is offered, accepting it can feel unfamiliar. Living this way can also become emotionally exhausting. Handling every disappointment, fear, and challenge alone requires enormous internal energy. From the outside, it may look like strength, but inside, it can feel like carrying the weight of the world without anyone to share it with. Many avoidant individuals stay busy with responsibilities and goals because productivity helps them regulate their emotions. But during quiet moments, something deeper may surface. a loneliness that is hard to explain. It's not necessarily loneliness from being alone, it's the feeling of being emotionally unseen. Even when people are around them, the emotional walls they built long ago make it difficult for others to fully reach them. Yet there is an important truth that brings hope: avoidant attachment is not permanent. These patterns were learned in childhood, which means they can also change with awareness and new experiences. When someone begins understanding that their emotional distance developed as a survival strategy, something powerful happens. Instead of blaming themselves, they start seeing their behavior with compassion. Those emotional walls were built for protection, but with time, patience, and safe relationships, those walls can slowly soften. Each moment of vulnerability met with understanding creates a new emotional memory. Gradually, the belief that closeness leads to pain can begin to change. So, when we ask how avoidant attachment begins, the answer is deeply human. It starts with small moments when a child's emotional needs are not fully met, moments when vulnerability is dismissed instead of comforted. Over time, the child adapts by becoming strong and independent earlier than they should have to be. But deep inside that independent adult still lives the child who once reached for comfort, the child who wanted to feel understood, and remembering that child changes everything. Because avoidant individuals are not people who don't care about connection. They are people who once cared so deeply that they had to protect themselves from the pain of not receiving it. And the most powerful truth is this: the same heart that learned to survive without emotional safety can also learn slowly and gently that safe love is possible.